Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check him out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Alright, folks, welcome back to Twisted Tales. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. Tonight's tale, I'm going to talk about Marshall Iwaasa. So this will be a missing persons episode here. So Marshall Iwaasa was born January 3rd, 1993. He disappeared on November 17th, 2019. He was actually from Lethbridge, Alberta, and he was 26 years old. So born in Lethbridge, Alberta, growing up, he was a very active guy. Played sports, playing football, rugby, all that fun stuff. And he loved to go camping. Camping's a pretty big deal everywhere, even especially in the summertime. So he grew up alongside his sister, Paige Fogan, and the two were actually pretty inseparable. They kept in touch even after she moved to Hawaii. So roughly every 6 months, she would visit Canada for a few weeks. So Marshall would actually go to Hawaii at Christmas time, and they'd celebrate their birthdays. It's only a few weeks apart. And they did all the Christmassy things together, baking Christmas cookies, making gingerbread houses, having bonfires, right down to the ugly Christmas sweaters. So, during the years that Fogan was living in Hawaii, she and Marshall kept in contact no matter what, every week or so. Until Marshall ended up going to school, which became a little harder to keep in touch, due to his school scheduling. In the summer of 2019, Fogan had returned to Canada for a family reunion. So Marshall and Fogan had planned a camping trip in Montana. They decided to go to a storage unit that was actually owned by Marshall, and as the trip was going, that was going to be about roughly a week. So the storage unit consisted of books, family items, household stuff, camping gear, which is just the main reason, he stopped by there just to prepare for their trip. So they had a good camping trip. Everything was fine. They all came back. And eventually his sister Paige had returned to Honolulu in August after their camping trip. So the summer of 2019, pretty much just a fun time with the family. Things got back to normal. Everyone was under the impression that Marshall would return to SAIT in the fall. So SAIT is actually the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. And in the fall semester, that's when he was going to go back, though the topic of schooling, wasn't brought up too often, so Marshall seemed to be avoiding certain questions when he was asked. He'd say things like, in my field, sometimes you don't need a degree, it's who you know and all your experience. So his sister mentioned that it seemed like Marshall was just testing the waters about going to school, but wasn't too sure. So, stating that he'd tell them about it when he was ready, and he just kind of left it at that, so nobody asked any more questions. Now, I'm not too sure if, Marshall wanted to focus more on work than school, but that's half the people here. They'd rather work and make bank than, especially Marshall himself. He was a pretty hard worker. Even right down, right out of high school, he had a job at a local grocery store, and as he got older, like we all do, he began working manual labor jobs in southern Alberta. Just a region well known for the oil and gas industry. There's lots of manual labor jobs on power lines, oil rigs, etc. So he did this until he enrolled in school, and he was going to do the software development. So he lived with friends in Lethbridge, and eventually he moved to Calgary. And his sister said Marshall had a few friends in Calgary, but wasn't an overly large group. So I guess he seemed like he kind of wanted to keep his social circle a little bit small. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we all do that, On Sunday, November 17th, Marshall spent the day cleaning his basement suite that he rented with a family in Calgary, Alberta. Just daily routine stuff, laundry, all that fun stuff, And later in the evening, his mom ended up having a computer problem, so he drove his dark blue 2009 GMC Sierra over to his mom's, and he helped her with that issue. And after he helped with that, it was around 11 p.m. Marshall decided that he was actually going to go to his storage unit to grab some stuff, head back to Calgary for school. So around 11:30, Marshall ended up at his storage unit, and he tried numerous times to gain access to it for a bit. This went on into the night. He'd enter his passcode in multiple times in a row, kind of like his code wasn't working. So to gain access to his storage unit, eventually it was around 6:30 in the morning, after he took multiple breaks, because his passcode just wouldn't work. So this happened around 6:30 in the morning that he got back in there, got his stuff, and he left around 8:30 in the morning. So this would be the last indication of Marshall. So we're not sure, if Marshall was alone or what happened, after everything still seemed to be intact in his storage locker. There's no video footage either of Marshall leaving the area, no evidence of Marshall or his truck over the next week or so. Now we're just going to dive into the north side industrial area here. So now the structure I'm going to talk about is actually called the Brian Waddington Hut. It's a structure in Felix Creek off the shores of Long Lake, British Columbia. So it's about a 14-hour drive from Lethbridge. It's kind of like a little hut or a cabin, if you will. So it sleeps up to 40 people, and the hut is about 15 to 20 kilometers from the main road. So it has two access points: the Felix Creek Trail main login road and the Felix Creek Trail. So now from the trailhead, it's about 2-3 hour hike to the hut, and the hut it's pretty much just online, like an online registration. So that's the only way you book it online and you head up. So that's the only way it can be used. And even driving across this terrain is nothing but mud, gravel, like a shit ton of potholes, and a bunch of creeks. So it's mostly accessible through four-wheel drive. And it's not a place that you just stumble upon. Pretty much, it's just a really remote location. Now, it was at this spot here that a group of hikers discovered Marshall's truck. It was completely burned, and that was on November 23rd, 2019. So roughly a week after he was last seen in Lethbridge. Now, around this scene, the hikers found 3 broken phones owned by Marshall. There was clothing all over the place. There was a PlayStation system and also an Xbox. They found an expired passport, and it also looked like parts of Marshall's truck ended up missing. So this determined that some of the truck had been stripped. Now, a few of Marshall's belongings seemed to be missing as well. His contact lenses, his school laptop, there was a backpack missing, contact solution, a Samsung Galaxy that he had, and his wallet. And none of these items were found. Now, a man named James Stark was one of the hikers who came across the burnt vehicle, and he posted photos to a Facebook group called South Coast Touring, along with the caption, "This felt like a crime scene," and had an eerie feeling. He ended up being interviewed by CTV News, stating that him and his friends were the only ones that had been registered to stay at the cabin, and they were on their way there before they made the discovery of Marshall's truck. Now, Marshall's sister, she said that he had no connection to that area, and nobody in the family were ever up that way. So BCRCMP got wind of this, and they spent about 2 days trying to get on the site, as the vehicle had been damaged to attempt to get up there. Now, upon arrival, they actually took more photos of the scene, just to try to figure out what happened. Now, on November 26, 2019, Marshall's sister and mother were actually in Hawaii when the RCMP called to ask if they knew where Marshall was. They didn't actually go into any details over the phone. They just stated that his truck had been found in a remote area at Pemberton, British Columbia. His mom and sister found it odd that the truck would be there without him. Thinking perhaps maybe it was stolen. So they called some family back home and a few friends just to see if they heard from him. I mean, Lethbridge isn't that big a place, so other family members actually ventured out and began searching for the missing family member. And they actually turned up nothing. So they waited for the other family to hightail it back from Hawaii, and there was nobody that spoke to Marshall lately, and nobody could find Marshall. So everyone wondered how Marshall's truck ended up 1,200 kilometers away in a strange place that he never ventured before, but eventually this led to Marshall Iwaasa being reported missing that day. So the family was actually pretty stressed over the next few days as they tried to figure out what happened to Marshall, and they were trying to get back from Hawaii in a hurry. Due to lack of footage of Marshall and his truck traveling from Lethbridge to Pemberton, his disappearance to his family was kind of mysterious. So they tried to get video surveillance from the storage unit at the time that he went missing, but the footage was actually unavailable. So Marshall's family turned to Facebook, and they made a group called Find Marshall Iwaasa. So that's a pretty cool thing, because it'll get more information out to the public about his disappearance, and possibly bring in some information as well. So the group's run by Marshall's family, in hopes that they can find video footage of him and his truck along the way from Lethbridge over to Pemberton, or any other routes that he might have taken along the way. Now, Marshall's financial records show no records of transactions. Nothing showed that he stopped for gas, and trucks need gas to venture, because most are pigs on gas. Like, even I know that. And so that brings the question, like, was anybody else driving Marshall's truck throughout the 1,200 kilometer trip? And there's also been a few discrepancies about the pictures taken by the hikers and the pictures taken by police. So, this actually caught the attention of Marshall's family. It's just like the way that things were strewn about on the ground, right? Like they were neatly placed. And they noticed that some items didn't belong to Marshall. Even earlier, when the family told police that the PS4 and the Xbox were Marshall's, his sister ended up going to check his place in Calgary, and his Xbox and PlayStation were still there. So the ones that were discovered at the scene weren't his, and nobody has any idea who they belong to. And there was also a steering column that was missing from his truck. RCMP actually confirmed that they didn't take it, so apparently it was always missing. So that just adds to the suspicion of who was up the scene, those last few days, maybe messing around with anything. But the RCMP had kept the found items well taken care of, but Fogan said the items weren't tested for DNA. Now, the RCMP of Lethbridge said they cannot test for DNA because they don't have any reasonable grounds to believe that a criminal offense had occurred. So police contacted Border Control, also just to notify them of Marshall's disappearance. They said that Marshall never legally entered the States, and at one point a private investigator was hired, but nothing was found about his disappearance or any information on the missing items. And they even checked pawn shops to see if anything was brought in and sold. Wednesday, December 4th, 2019, British Columbia RCMP announced that the search for Marshall had been suspended due to ongoing snowmelts, and the investigation was passed over from Pemberton RCMP over to Lethbridge Police. Now, May 22nd, 2020, cadaver dogs roamed the area that the truck was found, and that evening the family was notified that nothing was found and the search was completed. And it's just an exhaustive search was actually launched in British Columbia on June 24th, and this involved Pemberton and Lethbridge RCMP, some surrounding detachments, along with a search and rescue from Pemberton and Squamish. They had helicopters, they had a bunch of four-wheelers, just to gain access to the site. But they also had private investigators and members of the Canadian Search and Disaster Dogs Association that would start looking on the ground for clues, or, anything out of the ordinary. And everyone pulled together to find our missing friend here. RCMP fire investigators actually joined the investigation just to see the cause of the fire and to search Marshall's destroyed truck. Now, almost 9 months later, nobody can piece together what happened after 8:30 a.m. on Monday, November 18th. Nobody can turn up any information on his route, bank statements, missing items, or his phone activity. Some think that he could have just paid cash for the gasoline throughout the route, and Marshall had distinctive tattoos, distinctive hair, and his truck. So, it's not the kind of stuff that goes unnoticed. I mean, regardless of multiple stops needed to be made, this should be evidence enough to make this into a criminal case by police. Thoughts about Marshall and the elements were also tossed around. Like, even though the weather was pretty fair at the time of his disappearance, it got cold at night. There were animals in the woods, could have been chances of hypothermia, and his sister stated that, for the first few nights, Marshall would have been fine. It just would have been cold and uncomfortable for him. Marshall's family wanted to visit the site, but couldn't due to the ongoing investigation. They were told the site was too dangerous to go to, but over time, they actually made it up there, and it took them about 30 hours. Now, these private searches by the family, made by Marshall's sister Fogan, they believe that he was never at the site. Even the private investigators told them that if there had been a body up there, the search dogs would have found it by now. So now that that area had been searched, they could also explore other options to try to find Marshall. One mistake the family pointed out was how the RCMP didn't conduct a fire report on discovering the vehicle, the source of the fire, or the time it was started. So private investigators pushed for the results of the fire investigation, and they still had to wait for results. Now, if it comes back as arson, it can be justified as a criminal case. So until then, and the family just still reaches out for support from the community and other families that have had missing loved ones go missing. And their Facebook is also a really big help, and they're pretty grateful for all the awareness that spreads about Marshall. So just to check out the group, and if you have any info, just please share your info here on Find Marshall Iwaasa on Facebook, or you can contact Lethbridge Police. Reference the case number 190-30078. That's all I got for you, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Have yourself a lovely day. Have a good work week. Actually, no, the work week's over. It's Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Bye now.
Twisted Tales.